This week on The Wheelhouse. Voter security or voter suppression? Inside the Save America Act. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond, right here. Federal Republicans are working to enact stricter ID requirements ahead of midterm elections in November. The Save America Act has already passed the U.S. House. Today on The Wheelhouse, we look at the proposal and the ramifications it may have for American democracy. U.S. Congresswoman from Connecticut, Rosa DeLauro, will share her thoughts on that as well, so you're going to want to stay tuned for that. But first, President Donald Trump delivered his State of the Union address last night. There was also alternative programming as some Democrats skipped the Trump speech in favor of throwing their own event on the National Mall. Here to talk with us about what went down on Capitol Hill last night are two professors invested in America's future. Professor Arkan Fung, Professor of Citizenship at the Harvard Kennedy School. Professor Fung, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Frankie.
So good to talk to you here this morning. And joining me in studio, to my right, a sweater brother today. We're sweater brothers. Bilal Sekou, he's the Hilliard College Associate Professor of Politics and Government at the University of Hartford.
Good morning, Frankie, and go Hawks and go Buckeyes.
Go Hawks, go Buckeyes. The red-tailed hawk will fly in the snow, even though we're all really bedraggled here nowadays by the snow. Did you watch the State of the Union? What about the other one, the People's State of the Union? Or maybe you were binging something on Netflix instead. I don't know. Tell us about it. Hit us up on our YouTube stream or call us 888-720-9677. Let's talk about last night's State of the Union address. Bilal, any impressions there? Maybe not necessarily. I don't know how long people are watching this thing for. It's a long speech.
Right.
No matter what you think about journalism outlets, pretty much all journalists are in agreement that it was, and all outlets,
right,
it was a marathon.
And actually for me, let me just sort of step 10,000 feet on this thing, right? I normally, over the years teaching, have encouraged my students to watch the State of the Union address. I think in recent years, especially this State of the Union we saw last night, it really points to, I think, a real troubling shift in the meaning and the purpose of State of the Union addresses. And so last night, what we saw was a great deal of hyperpartisanship. We saw amazing moments of, 2 or 3 words and then a standing round of applause. It felt more like a reality TV show and sort of an entertainment, sort of moment, rather than talking about where the nation is at, the issues the nation faces, and also proposals to deal with some of those challenges going forward. And I saw a lot less of that occur last night. And I think that, to me, is a troubling sign for our political system at this moment, but also what the meaning of a State of the Union address actually is.
Do you go or do you not go is a big question. And Arkan, I'm going to get your take on that in a second. I'm going to play you a clip first. Some Democrats skipped the State of the Union, holding a People's State of the Union, with Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy speaking at the event. Murphy spoke from the National Mall. You'll hear from him about why he skipped out on the Trump speech. Here it is.
This union is in crisis right now. By lawless law enforcement, our democracy is wilting under ceaseless attack from a president who wants to be a despot. Millions of Americans are losing their health care because the president has chosen corruption to pad the pockets of his billionaire friends instead of helping average Americans. You're not going to hear any of that in that speech tonight. But by being here for the People's State of the Union, you are going to hear the real story of America.
If you're watching this, you'll see to his left is Farishte Ganjave, who's a guest of his. Now we're going to hear from her, and she works in Connecticut as an advocate for migrants. Take a listen to this as well, Arkan.
Mothers have called me asking, it is safe to go to my child's appointment. Women have asked if they should cancel English classes. Afghan families and many immigrant families are confused about their legal status and afraid to travel for work, even within their own states.
Before we talk about go or don't go, I guess the big message that folks are having here is you see that was broadcast on moveon.org. They spoke about an hour before Trump did. They're talking about things that you're not going to hear in the State of the Union, and or at least what they were predicting an hour beforehand. And they were right. There wasn't necessarily any mention of the Epstein files in the State of the Union last night. But a big part of that messaging was about ICE and law enforcement, Epstein and that case, and healthcare costs. And that's the point, Archon, is that they're saying that you're not going to hear that in Trump speeches.
Yeah, I think we didn't. Well, we certainly heard about immigration in the president's speech. We didn't hear about the killings of Alex Preddy or Renee Good. I guess to your question, I do think it's important for Democrats to go to the State of the Union. I think it would be good to tamp down the tendency of political appearances to be social media spots and to introduce a little more, reintroduce a little more listening and conversation and deliberation. And I really believe in giving everyone every opportunity to do that. And I think Democrats and other people who are opposed to the administration policies have plenty of other opportunities to talk about those issues, which I absolutely agree are very, very important. It's the kind of political theater part of it that I understand why Senator Murphy and Donald Trump feel like they have to create political theater on social media. But I think it degrades our political deliberation and our deliberation in this democracy.
Couple of things I'm going to point out to you, Bilal, and I'm just going to try to say this as a journalist as best as I can. In the lead up, a lot of the talk was about if you're going to go, if you're a Democrat, sit there quietly and listen. There's a couple of things that happened when Democrats did show up yesterday. Yeah. There was what we saw with Al Green, the protest with the sign. There was a few moments that I want to remark here. There was Nancy Pelosi. You talked about hyper-partisanship. Trump didn't have anything nice to say about Nancy. He never really does. And then there was the part where they were talking about stock trading and making it illegal. And that's, of course, a snipe at Nancy Pelosi. But Elizabeth Warren stood up during that and clapped. And that seemed to distract the president, I think, is to be fair, when that happened. So go or don't go.
Right. For me, I think, and I think Chuck Schumer summed it up well, this is a decision that every lawmaker needs to make. But I think for me, it brings me back to my larger point about what is the actual purpose of the State of the Union address. And at least I can imagine for the next couple that we will see the hyperpartisanship, the attacks on opponents. I mean, we haven't seen presidents who point to the opposition party and say they're crazy. We haven't seen, situation where, and this isn't just during the Trump era, but even going back to the Obama era, where the decorum of that moment is broken, where people yell things like "you lie" or stand up. So I think that moment has really changed quite significantly, and it really is a sign of the deterioration of our sort of national politics and our ability to use these sort of ritualistic moments that are part of our system to really, again, deal with the issues that are important to the American people, to talk about policy solutions to those problems, to use this as a moment to unify the country. This president speaks to his base. Those are the only people he's really interested in talking to. And in many ways, that talk last night was more like one of his political rallies that was designed to excite his base about what he does. And this is setting aside a real discussion about whether anything he really talked about of substance actually was factual, which is a whole different conversation the racism and xenophobia that was on display in his speech, the attacks on the Somali community, the confrontation that you're talking about at the very beginning with Representative Al Green, who brought out a sign and said that blacks aren't apes, which is a response to the video he posted, which was directed at Barack Obama and his wife. And so this has turned into a circus.
It's crazy politics. that you just mentioned that. I had a reaction, a visceral reaction to that. Is that's 2026 in a nutshell? That somebody has to bring a sign that says that. And before I get to you, Arkan, you're talking about hyper-partisanship. They played a clip on CNN yesterday when they had Nancy Pelosi on the show. And, of course, Nancy Pelosi hasn't gotten any sort of respect from Trump. But they played a clip of a Bush State of the Union when he says, I get to say this for the first time, Madam Secretary, and then she gets a standing ovation. Different times, Arkan, in America in 2026.
Yeah. Hey, Bilal, I'm wondering, I have mixed feelings about the Al Green. I think it was very appropriate for him to put up the sign because the post that went up on the president's Truth Social account was so abhorrent and racist. But then it creates, I think that was a moment, a social media moment that the president was looking for, is to demonstrate that Representative Green and Representative Omar are, to depict them as angry, off the chain, irrational. But I think in both of those cases, I applaud their pushback, but I don't know if it's going to be successful politically. It may be more successful for the president politically.
And again, I think this speaks to the base. I mean, for many in the black community, the attacks on Barack Obama, who is still the most popular, one of the most popular people on the face of the planet, and certainly within the black community, I often joke with people that my mother can tell me when his birthday is, but she struggles to remember my birthday. And so this is an incredibly popular
that exercise live. We're actually FaceTimed with your mom, and you did that. Yes,
exactly.
I remember that.
So for many people, especially in the black community, this pushback was something that they didn't even see occur with Barack Obama. But I think in general, Arkan, I think you're right in terms of how this may or may not be interpreted, but I think for the Democratic Party base who feels like the party is not pushing back enough and really fighting fire with fire, that was one of those viral moments, and I think you're right. It's all now plays for social media. It plays for, clickbaits. I mean, and that's the world we live in right now in our politics. I think it is harmful for our democracy, but it's a part of what we are now faced with.
That's great.
One thing we're going to talk about later is the potential for federal Republican lawmakers to try to change filibuster rules to get a voting reform package called the Save America Act passed. And I'm kind of running through this now because I want to get to the DeLauro interview so that we could talk a little bit more later. Joe Courtney and I talked over Zoom yesterday. Courtney says that Trump and Senate Republicans should instead be focused on getting an extension of Affordable Care Act subsidies passed through Congress to alleviate skyrocketing healthcare premiums. One of his guests that he brought down to D.C. is a constituent from Mystic, and this is Lee Burdett Williams. Let's hear from her. She says she and her spouse are now paying $2,500 a month for health insurance that used to cost $750.
We are very fortunate that we are able to pay this high premium every month. We've had to tighten our belts in ways that are pretty discouraging for two people who have worked and saved our entire lives.
So there is that GOP push to get the SAVE Act passed, and yet the extension of healthcare subsidies has stalled. We're talking about political will here and what people are focused on and what they're not focused on. What do you think, Arkan?
I guess I think that
the priorities are a little bit different.
Chew gum at the same time. I think that there's the affordability debate, which I think is extremely important. People are hurting, especially on the healthcare issue. But then there are the range of issues that are not about affordability, that are more core issues for the traditional progressives, like the creeping authoritarianism, ICE, Democratic backsliding. And, I resist the centrist argument, the play to the moderate and middle argument. I think you need to do absolutely both at the same time. I don't see any reason why they're exclusive.
Bilal, you have a quick thought?
No, I absolutely agree with Arkan, what he's saying. I think, chewing gum and walking at the same time is just something that politicians ought to be able to do. Certainly when so many of your constituents want to see these issues around affordability addressed. I think the Democratic Party historically has been a party that has sort of viewed itself as a working class party that deals with those kinds of issues. But I think also at the same time, the threats to our democracy are real. And, the creeping authoritarianism is real. The concentration of corporate power and billionaire class and the influence they have. I mean, all of these things should scare the bejeebies out of, to use a Joe Biden type word, scare the bejeebies out of all of us, in that particular sense. And so I think, yes, they have to do both.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. You've been listening to Professor Archon Fung, professor of citizenship at the Harvard Kennedy School, and Dr. Bilal Sekou, professor at the University of Hartford. They're going to stick with us, but first, we're going to talk to Rosa DeLauro, who was at last night's State of the Union. She tells us why she went, even though some of her colleagues didn't go. And she updates us on a federal funding fight involving the agency that houses Federal Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. We're standing by to take your reaction. Hit us up on our YouTube stream or call 888-720-9677. Rosa DeLauro is next on The Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro has a full plate on Capitol Hill right now. She presumably took a break last night from brokering negotiations on a federal funding resolution involving money for the Department of Homeland Security, taking President Donald Trump's State of the Union address. I spoke to her Tuesday, a few hours before she went down to the chamber to hear Trump speak. Here's that conversation. Now I'm joined by Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro. Congresswoman DeLauro, so great to have you on the show today. Thank you for joining us.
Wonderful to be with you, my friend.
Thank you for joining us from Capitol Hill. We appreciate having you on the show. We're taping this hours before the State of the Union address, so people are going to see it live on Wednesday morning, or excuse me, they're going to see it on Wednesday morning. But help me just understand this. You're going to the State of the Union. Some other folks aren't going. Help me with your decision to go and why it's important to go. In your mind?
Well, I'm a member of the Congress. The president gives a State of the Union address every year around this time. And so I think it's part of my job to go and to listen to what he has to say. It's very simple. It's my job.
What about for the other folks that aren't going, your colleagues that are going to be going to the...
Everybody makes their own decision. I don't, I don't comment on what others want to do. I know what I'm going to do.
There's reaction in real time to what's going on within the administration. That also involves funding, and there's all the work that you're doing in appropriations to try to make sure that the Department of Homeland Security can get some funding. Can you kind of update us on what's happening there?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. And so that people know, funding for the Department of Homeland Security has lapsed. And it really is unfortunate that my Republican colleagues would rather defend the lawlessness and the recklessness of ICE than to pay our TSA personnel, our FEMA. These are all issues on which there is agreement. So there is no need to hold up the funding for these folks. But as I said, unfortunately, the last offer we made to the Republicans, to the White House, was about a week ago. And so far as I know from this morning, that we have not heard anything back. So there's an unwillingness to really negotiate that. So if people are forced to work without pay, if we reduce our disaster relief funding, if we negatively impact all these other areas, it really is the result of an intransigence of either the White House, my Republican colleagues, to engage in the conversations. Now, let me just say this to you, because I introduced legislation. I introduced it about 3 weeks ago. What we would do is to fund the TSA, FEMA, Coast Guard, cybersecurity, Secret Service, et cetera. There's no disagreement on any of that. Why should these folks be held hostage? Let's fund those agencies through the rest of the year. In the meantime, on a parallel track, let us debate the issue of ICE and where that's going, because that's where the difficulty lies. It doesn't, lie with the other agencies. And so that is something that I am I think makes good sense for us to do, to keep these agencies going and to have the very serious conversation about what is a lawless and reckless, out of control agency with ICE.
Where's the holdup in terms of with the Republicans? Is this something that you've worked out within your colleagues in the House? Is this happening with the senators or just the White House?
No. I mean, the legislation is there. We're getting co-sponsors, but my Republican colleagues are not, getting on the bill and so forth. But we're looking at various ways in which we can, get this bill at least in some way to the floor of the House and so forth to address the issue, which is very serious, because I think the negotiations over ICE are going to go on for a while. It's not a slam dunk. And so why are we going to hold up? These people are working without getting paid. That's crazy.
The formal support for having a funding bill for DHS, they're conflating that with not wanting to abolish ICE or not wanting to have these reforms. So what do you say to those people that have criticized you all that have voted formally for the proposal in the last couple of weeks? What would you say to, I think it was faith leaders that have come out. What would you say to them?
No, just look, we have the opportunity to overhaul, to reform an agency, and we can begin to do that in the short term. Imagine if we got them to say yes to a judicial warrant. Imagine, would that not be a reform? Would that not be if we said you can't go? Do we protect sensitive locations? These are real reforms, so forth. So, and by the same token, we have agencies that are part of this bill who are functioning very well, and there is no disagreement on it. Let us fund those pieces, and let's have the discussion about ICE.
I'm glad we talked to clear that up. That's very important information and nuance there. Let's talk about the GOP effort to overhaul voting here, at least what we're seeing in the last couple of months here in terms of potentially having voter ID. It's called the Save America Act. Or certain voter ID requirements that would be stricter, would impose stricter voter ID requirements. What are your thoughts on the proposal that's sponsored by the U.S. House there with Chip Roy, that Republican that's in the House, and then Senator Mike Lee?
Yeah, well, listen, I go to vote every year, sometimes a couple times a year, and I'm asked for an ID. And I take out my driver's license, I hand it over to the clerk. She checks that, she looks at it, she comes back, she hands it back to me, and then I proceed to go and head in to cast my vote. So having an ID, I don't have a problem with ID, but let's take a look at what this is about. Frankie, let's take a look at what this is about. This is about voter suppression. That is what the end goal here. So you're going to It's about disenfranchising millions of eligible voters. Just a couple of things I think that are they're putting on burdensome restrictions, that you need to have a passport. Half the public of the United States does not have a passport to use for identification. And it's around $130, $140 to get a passport. Cost of living, you're going to charge people to get a passport in order to create, in order to be able to proof of identification. For so many women, this is so burdensome for women. Women have changed their names. And then you got to go back and get a birth certificate or some other.
Hard enough to change your license after you change your name too, yeah.
Oh my God. But my point is, this is the point. No one says that you shouldn't have a way to identify yourself. We've had the system in place. And, the SAVE Act is based on a lie that President Trump has continually peddled since January 6th, that there is widespread voter fraud. There is not. And that has been documented. And so what this, again, is, it is about voter suppression. It's not going after fraud, and it is to really disenfranchise millions and millions of eligible voters and put and have people be afraid to go to vote. So it's going to be, this makes it harder, as I said, for American women, military voters, rural voters, people of color, elderly, students, lower income Americans, etc., Native Americans. So it's a false premise, and I voted no on the legislation, and I will continue to vote no.
You could help us out with this, because it seems like from an outsider's perspective that things are sort of changing on a daily basis down in Capitol Hill in terms of when the filibuster might apply and when it might not. So at least what we're hearing from the outside is that while this is obviously passed the House, in the Senate, there's talk about Republicans maneuvering around the filibuster to make it happen. Maybe it's going to take a majority vote rather than 60 votes, a simple majority vote. So help me understand what you're hearing on that front.
Well, look, my sense is that there's the same kind of understanding of the very nature of this legislation in the Senate as there is in the House. That, again, these are ways in which to suppress the vote. Now, that has, this is not the first time that it's happened. I mean, I think the Trump administration has looked for any number of ways to suppress the vote and to make people ineligible to cast a vote here. So,
hey, you're talking about voter suppression here. Is there a concern when you hear about voter suppression? You're actually talking about this in your office? Are you concerned about our democracy when you have to talk about something like that?
Look, you know how many people died for the right to vote in this nation? It's fundamental. It's who we are. It's why, as I say, this is premised on this lie that the president has made over and over again. He can say it as many times as he'd like, but it's still a lie, that there's widespread voter fraud. That is not the case. And people have fought and died to be able to cast a vote. And this administration, this president, what he wants to do is to deny people a vote and to disenfranchise them. And it is fundamental. It is really bedrock for the U.S. government and the rule of law for this, for people to be able to exercise their right to vote in this country.
Last question here. In a midterm year, with all these questions that you're having about democracy and some of the things that we're seeing with the Trump administration, and even some talk from the 2020 election, which has already been decided here, are you worried about GOP efforts to reshape ballot access here ahead of the elections in November?
Yes, I am. Absolutely.
And is there anything that could be done to sort of combat it?
Well, what we're trying to do is to safeguard against that. I also think, I don't put it past this administration, to post National Guard people to intimidate folks about coming out to vote. I think we have to be very mindful. We have to work with the courts. We have to be vigilant about what they're doing and where they want to go. We have to preserve the right to vote in the United States.
Congresswoman DeLauro, thank you so much for coming on the Wheelhouse this morning.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to talk to you. Take care.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. After the break, Arkan Fung and Bilal Siku will be back to dive deeper into the SAVE Act. Look at me reading this morning. And while it's only February, talking about these sort of Democratic items and ideas because something's happening in November. The midterms are coming. We're here to talk about it. Hit us up now at 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Back with more Wheelhouse after a short break. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We heard from Connecticut Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro with an update on what's happening on Capitol Hill from a GOP-led voting reform package called the Save America Act to last night's State of the Union. Now back to take us through the SAVE Act and then into the midterm elections are Professor Arkan Fung, Professor of Citizenship at the Harvard Kennedy School, and Bilal Siku, the Associate Professor of Politics and Government at the University of Hartford. Call us in the next few minutes to get on before the show ends. Got about 16, 17 minutes left of airtime, so you better make sure you call right now. Taking calls on everything we can, everything we're talking about, State of the Union, SAVE Act, midterms. If you're brief, we could talk about anything, really. 888-720-9677. We addressed a few things there, Bilal, with the Congresswoman, including the Save America Act, which would introduce stricter voting ID requirements and recently passed through the U.S. House. She says it's a bill based on a lie. Claims of voter fraud in 2020 election haven't been substantiated in federal court. What do you say?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to top anything she said. I think she laid out the case for why this is just bad public policy, and the hope is that the Democrats will hold the line and will not allow this to pass in the Senate. One of the things I'm struck by is that back in 2002, a Republican president signed the Help America Vote Act, right? And what is so sharply different about this effort, and the representative is correct, it is an effort to suppress voting rights. But when we think about the Help America Vote Act, it was about helping Americans vote. It did things like expand the number of documents you could use to actually vote on election day. And so in addition to photo identification, you can come in with, a receipt from a utility bill. I am a bit troubled because she's not the first Democrat I've heard say that they're okay with photo ID requirements. One of the things that was great about the Help America Vote Act is that it expanded the type of document that could be used in order to vote. Because what's at risk is probably about 9% of the population does not have a photo identification or easy way to prove their citizenship. We're talking about 21 million eligible voters who may in fact be prevent it from
I think
voting,
she's saying
and
she's
that's
okay
a
with
problem.
some kind of identification being shown.
Yeah.
And because you saw the turn there that
Right.
she said that it's not about that.
But the
So,
way,
yeah.
but the way she describes it and the way she starts off about being asked for photo ID, you're asked for identification. You're not asked for photo ID. Photo ID is a form of identification that you can present. I think it's important to make that point because if you concede that ground, right, then it becomes a kind of poll tax. People have to go out and pay for real ID. People have to go out, and a lot of people don't have those documents. A lot of immigrants who've been naturalized as citizens may not have easy access to documents like birth certificates and other things. So this, she's absolutely right. This is an effort to disenfranchise people, but they're absolutely wrong, I think, in ceding that kind of ground. Language really matters, and if it comes out that this becomes an effort to institute a national photo ID, I think that will result in millions of Americans losing their right to vote, losing their ability to vote and to participate in the political system.
And that's a good point, Bilal, because if you think about it, today's whataboutism is about voter ID right now. And if you are talking about the Save America Act, you're going to be asked, Archon, well, do you not want voter ID? Do you support voter ID at the polls? So that's kind of like what Democrats are dealing with on this issue, or at least the opposition.
Yeah. So I think the current version of the SAVE Act is pretty bonkers, and it goes way beyond.
Is that a Biden word, bonkers?
Voter, yeah, it's a Bidenism. Way beyond the voter ID debates that we've been having for a long time. And so, I imagine we'll get into some of the details of the SAVE Act, and lots of people talk about, worry about the details and who's going to be disenfranchised. But I think there's like three things to worry about. One, which Representative DeLauro talked about, but I want to lift up here, is I think the main thing it's about is a narrative about what's happening in American politics. And the premise of the SAVE Act is that there are millions of people who are non-citizens who are voting, and it's a Democrat, part of a Democrat political ploy that begins with open borders to let a bunch of immigrants in who are non-citizens and then take over the political process by voting. And so that's the problem that the SAVE Act is meant to solve by requiring proof of citizenship to register to vote, and now in the most recent version, to vote. And so it's probably for a bunch of your listeners, Frankie, it seems like, oh, well, nobody really believes that. But that's not true. A lot of people actually believe that narrative to be true in public opinion polls. And the debate about the SAVE Act validates that narrative. It's like, oh, we have to have this major piece of legislation to solve this problem of massive non-citizen voting. But all of the actual kind of evidence is that there is minuscule non-citizen voting. So Utah went through its whole the voter rolls to find how many non-citizens, and they found one. And Texas has done a similar exercise, and Michigan has done a similar exercise, and Iowa has done a similar exercise, and it ends up being just a fraction of 1%, even in the Texas case.
I'm gonna do what you're talking about here, and I'm gonna move the goalposts, as you're kind of alluding to right there. First of all, I'm going to do a journalistic interpretation of what Donald Trump said in the State of the Union last night regarding the Save America Act, and it goes as follows. Trump asked people to support the SAVE Act in his speech last night, repeating false claims about widespread non-citizen voter fraud. That's not what he said, but we're giving you a paraphrase version of it because some of that language you were alluding to was in his speech, and it was very divisive. And where it isn't true is in the federal lawsuits that were filed to try to figure out what happened in the 2020 election, where they say there was widespread fraud. 0-64 at last count in terms of trying to prove voter fraud. Now, Archon, you're talking about voter rolls. What's being brought up a lot of times as we hear this, and I watched all the shows last night, so it's in my head, is the purging of voter rolls and looking through this. You talked about Utah having one. In Kansas, I think there was 9. Some folks will then say, well, do you want to have any voter fraud at all? We're trying to purge the voter rolls here, and we succeeded because we got 1 or we got 9. That's one example of the goalpost sort of moving. So where are you at this conversation, guys? Are are you willing to keep having it over the next 8 months here before the midterms?
I'll let Archon start first if he's got a comment on that.
I feel like you're about to pull out a notebook. You're excited. I'm looking at him. He's eager with anticipation.
I'm willing to have the secure elections conversation. Absolutely. I think there should be trust, and only people who are eligible to vote should be able to vote. Absolutely. But the SAVE Act, again, is premised on this narrative that is just so flatly not true. And then there are two other things about the SAVE Act. One is the chaos factor, right? If it were actually to go into effect, and it's intended to go into effect before the midterms, so many every election jurisdiction would have to change how it does business in a very short amount of time, right? And so I think that creates all sorts of problems. And, after that day in November, there's going to be all sorts of fights about how quickly they were able to implement and do what they were supposed to do if it passes, which I think it probably won't, right? And then the third factor is the disenfranchisement factor, which both Bilal and Representative DeLauro brought up. But that one is confusing to me, right? Old style poll taxes and, kind of getting voting booths off of college campuses, that's pretty targeted. But we don't know, I think, what the disenfranchisement effects of this thing would be were it to kick in. Like the states where the least people have the least likely to have passports are very, very red states, right? And so you're going to have a passport or a birth certificate to prove your citizenship to register to vote. And how does that cut in terms of Democrats and Republicans? And I don't really know.
And by the way, it's illegal to vote in federal elections if you're a non-citizen.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Already.
Yeah.
Already.
But the only thing a couple of things I would add to what Archon is saying, though, is that even when we look at the history of voting suppression, especially as it took place in the South, not only were blacks being disenfranchised, but also many poor whites were being disenfranchised as well. And ultimately, the goal was political power and the ability of elites to dominate. And I think what we have clearly is an oligarch class of people who feel like they should be in power and really don't believe that everybody should vote unless they vote the way they want them to vote. The one thing I will add as a fourth piece of what Archon said is that this isn't constitutional. The U.S. Constitution leaves to the states the right to decide about the eligibility of voting.
Some of these federal Republicans.
It's in the 10th Amendment, Frankie. And so this idea that the federal government can sort of step in and do this, right, is simply goes against what the spirit of the Constitution is about. It goes against what the founders did when they created the Constitution, and they handed over that responsibility to the states in terms of determining eligibility for who can vote. And again, what's interesting about this is an effort to take away a right as opposed to expanding a right, and that's something we should all be deeply troubled about.
We're living in a crappy time in America. That's the best thing. I wanted to use the SH word there instead, but I'll say crappy because just on the point that you're making, I listened last night to a black woman talk about how her grandmother didn't have ID and wasn't able to have a birth certificate and present it and always had to go through a different means to show ID. And then one of the colleagues on the dais said, yeah, Americans need to work harder to get ID. So we're just in a time where you're not necessarily going to understand what your fellow man or woman or person is going through at this time. There's the SAVE Act, Archon, and then according to the New York Times, there's the Make Elections Great Again Act. Mega. That includes other congressional efforts to sort of edit the electorate. That's one way to put it.
Yeah, so MEGA would eliminate ranked choice voting. It would, I believe, require the states to go through and purge the voting rolls more often. And I think those are some of the main things that it would require. And then it would require strict voter ID, although the strict voter ID has been rolled into the current version of the SAVE Act is kind of my reading of what's happened, which is important to understand. So, kind of MEGA goes a couple steps further. So
Yeah. And I really like what Archon has said, that this is premised on something that many people, especially in the base of the Republican Party, but also among a lot of Republican lawmakers, state elected officials, really believe this idea that the election was stolen. What I'm particularly nervous about, even if they don't succeed at the national level, I think we're going to see various parts of this implemented at the state level in red states.
Chris in West Hartford, you have a phone call, and I'm going to have Bilal dissect it because he knows a little bit or two about voting rights in Connecticut. Go ahead, Chris.
Yes, hi. I was wondering, in light of all of this, is there anything that the state legislature can or should do to protect our rights as voters in Connecticut?
Shout out to Chris and shout out to the League of Women Voters in Connecticut. Thank you so much for the call, Chris. I'm going to go through this really quickly. Go ahead, Bilal.
Very, very good question. I think one of the things that's interesting about Connecticut and my work with Common Cause and also serving at one point on the National Governing Board with Archon was that we really worked very hard in Connecticut to expand access to the vote here in the state. And so we did a number of things that you're likely to see roll back in other states. We've actually brought and introduced here in Connecticut. And I think our elections are safer than they are in many other places. We have a Secretary of State in Stephanie Thomas, who I think is really deeply committed to not only protecting our elections, making sure that they're secure, but also expanding access and opportunity. I think we have a governor who feels that way and also a legislature that also feels that way. So I'm less concerned, at least in Connecticut, with seeing those things roll back.
Why I haven't been looking at you in your face and I've been digging into my iPad in the last couple of minutes is because I was trying to see the Connecticut Voting Rights Act.
Right.
We tried to codify, or at least we did, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act into law in Connecticut, right?
Yeah, and that was accomplished here in Connecticut. And again, we've had success. We've expanded the voting rights of people on parole. We've expanded through adding on early voting. We've done no excuse absentee voting. They're still trying to figure out how to make that process work. But we've also added a number of other election measures that really expand access and opportunity in the state. And in that sense, Connecticut actually deserves a lot of credit. We did all of that because we were actually lagging behind in many ways in those areas. It was a very difficult journey. It took us about 20 years to accomplish a lot of this, but I think Connecticut has made tremendous progress.
Archon, I have a sort of a hypothetical for you. I guess it's not a hypothetical because at least it's being bandied about in Congress right now. Are you for Congress requiring states to give their voting rolls to the Department of Homeland Security?
I am not.
Of course.
I am not for that. I mean, it's happening, and it's interesting that a large number, the vast majority of election officials, both Democrat and Republican, have resisted that initiative. I think in large part because they don't know what the federal government and what DOJ will do with that data at all. And, I think rightly they consider it part of their obligation to protect the data security of people in their states. So, no, I would not favor that.
There's a lot of things happening in Fulton County, Georgia right now, Bilal, and we text about this a little bit back and forth, trying to figure out what's happening there. And again, the legislation, the litigation has dictated that the Trump administration is not winning in federal court, trying to prove that the 2020 election had widespread fraud. Yet they're digging into votes, and they actually seized some, as I understand it, in Fulton County. What does that kind of have for?
It'll be interesting what Archon has to say after what I say. But I really think this isn't about finding evidence of fraud. This is about continuing to sow the seeds of doubt about the integrity of our elections, right? And so this continues that sort of broader narrative of massive election fraud, the belief that you really can't trust the outcome of elections, especially if Republicans, for example, lose, then that clearly is evidence that fraud or that the election was stolen. So I think what seizing the ballots in Fulton County, and also what will likely happen going forward into 2026, where we will see an uptick in ICE activity in a number of states, especially blue states, especially critical battleground areas of the country, we're likely to see, and they've even talked about—
What does voting have to do with immigration and customs enforcement?
And again, the idea is intimidation. The idea is sowing seeds of doubt about the integrity of the election, the outcome of the election, unless it's an outcome that the president approves of. And I think ultimately that is the goal. They're not going to find anything. There have been multiple audits in Fulton County. You're not going to find anything. Archon has already talked about the research that's been done. Even the Heritage Foundation did a huge study of voting that occurred and found very little evidence of any kind of real sort of voter fraud. And so this is a red herring, but it's really designed to sow seeds of doubt.
Archon, this is from the White House. Voter ID is extremely popular with Americans. Fact, it says. 83% of Americans favor requiring all voters to show government-issued photo ID to vote. So you talked about them using one part of the narrative to say that people want this. Do people really want this? What do the public opinion shows?
Yeah, the public opinion, I think that's right. The public opinion is in favor of voter ID.
But are they in favor of the SAVE Act, I think is the question. Yeah, I should.
That's very different. Yeah. The SAVE Act requires proof of citizenship, which amounts to a passport or a birth certificate for most people, which is much, much, much more demanding than just about any state's voter ID. I mean, I think there are probably 4 or 5 that have driver's licenses that testify to citizenship, but it's much, much more demanding. I wanted to go back to Fulton County for a second. I have a scarier kind of interpretation. The scarier thing about, certainly Bilal's correct about the backward looking, Trump believes he really won Georgia.
We only have about 30 seconds here, Archon. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. The scary thing about Fulton County is that it sets a precedent. So what if the FBI and the DOJ seize ballot boxes in November 2026 in jurisdictions where they suspect that there's voter fraud? And that breaks the chain of custody of the ballots, and it becomes very difficult to determine who actually won those jurisdictions.
We ran out of time, unfortunately. Man, I could have talked about this with you guys all day. Professor Archon Fung, Harvard Kennedy School professor, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Frankie.
And Dr. Bilal Sekou, professor at the University of Hartford, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Today's show, produced by Tale Ricketson. What a show it was. Edited by Patrick Scale. Thank you to Dylan Reyes and Bradley O'Connor and the rest of our crew here and Megan Boone. Download The Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.